Okay, so thanks for joining me. Today we're going to go ahead and take a look at what could be considered top news in Ireland from the date range of January 3rd to January 10th, 2026. It's a retrospective on the news. The date I'm recording this is around the 25th of March. So just to take a quick look back, and then we'll certainly be moving forward. But what was happening in the start of the year from the 7th to the 10th in the RDS? Well, we had the BT Young Scientists and Technology exhibition, I guess you could say. There was a lot of topics that were presented by various presenters, people who came to go and join the event. The overarching theme, kind of the most high-level project view, would be the likes of AI in education, mental health tracking, and sustainability in agriculture. One interesting thing about these, we won't name them all, but we'll certainly name a few things that were happening that people saw. Um, what we experienced during that time was AI projects saw a 75% increase in submissions. Many students were focusing on how to responsibly integrate AI tools into the classroom. We certainly won't name all of the tools that were logged or presentations that were given, but a couple that were put in that might be of note were the likes of MarkEd, which was a way to stop AI watermark removers. This was developed by students at Loretto College in Stevens Green, and this project addressed the arms race between AI generated content and academic integrity by creating a more robust watermarking solution. We also saw another submission which could be referred to as personalized learning algorithms. I guess you could say it's a topic, but several projects, one, for example, that was submitted by the Anastoiman Community College, explored using reinforcement learning to create robotic or software-based tutors that adapt to students' specific learning pace and difficulties. One that I found was interesting related to bias mitigation, which was a project from Rathmore Grammar School, which was to apply abstract mathematical theories to identify and reduce racial discrimination as well as gender biases within AI models used in the education setting. To touch on mental health tracking, what we did see as well was mental health and well-being accounted for roughly 13% of all entries this year, with a significant shift towards wearable technologies and data-driven insights. For example, you might be wearing an Apple Watch or a Garmin right now and checking your heart rate. It might not necessarily relate to mental health tracking, but that's just an example of a wearable technology. There was a submission related to emotional suppression analysis, and this was a study from St. Dominic's High School which investigated the long-term impact of emotional suppression through harmful linguistics, using data to track how language patterns correlate with mental well-being over time. Without forgetting sustainable agricultural tools, agricultural submissions remains a cornerstone of the exhibition, with a quarter of all projects focusing on some form of environmental sustainability. One which I found quite interesting was Sheep Strength 2. This is a standout project submitted from a college in Sligo, Ursuline College to be specific, which investigated using sheep's wool to reinforce concrete. This provides a sustainable, market-friendly use for wool, benefiting sheep farmers while reducing the carbon footprint of construction materials. Be interested to see where that goes. I've got a friend out in Connemara who works with sheep, so he might find that interesting as well. You might share it with your friends that work in the sheep industry too. Another one that was interesting was fogponics and crop production. A group from Clonkilty Community College investigated fogponics, an advanced form of aeroponics that uses minimal water and nutrient-rich fog to grow crops, making it a highly sustainable alternative for modern farming. We'll have to see where that goes in the next year or so. But let's take a minute to go from science and technology related events to the economy. So there was a new budget rollout in the start of 2026. Generally is a new budget every year, but to take a couple high level looks at what might have hit the headlines at that time, at that point in history between the 1st of January and the 5th of January. You'll see a couple highlights on the screen. So for example, social welfare, the €10 weekly boost. The €10 increase is a maximum weekly rate applies to nearly all core social protection payments. This is a flat rate increase, meaning it provides a higher percentage-based boost to those on lower tier payments compared to higher ones. Who would the primary recipients be? For example, pensioners, people with disabilities, carers, and job seekers. What about qualified adults? There are also a proportional increase for qualified adults or dependents, typically around €6.60 to €7, depending on the specific scheme. In the world of child support, people saw this as a historic jump. The weekly rate for a child under 12 rose by €8, which would be now €58, while those 12 and over saw it rose by €16 to €78. Touching on labor in relation to minimum wage and USC alignment. As of January 1st, 2026, the national minimum wage officially rose to €14.15. You will see €13.50 on the screen, but just note that it rose to €14.15 per hour for those aged 20 and over. $13.50 was the rate from 2025. To ensure workers actually felt the increase or noticed the increase, the government also adjusted the USC or Universal Social Charge. Some notes on that: the 2% band. The entry threshold for the 2% USC rate was increased to €28,700. The goal: this ensures that the full-time workers on a minimum wage does not slip into the higher 3% USC band, effectively locking in the pay rise. Looking towards fuel allowances, higher rates and a wider net, you could say, the fuel allowance is considered by some to be a vital support for nearly 500,000 households in Ireland. What is the rate increase? The weekly payment rose by €5 to €38 per week. This is paid for 28 weeks, totaling €1,000 and €1,064 for the season. The WFP expansion. In a major policy shift, recipients of the Working Family Payment, or WFP as previously stated, now automatically qualify for the fuel allowance. A note on implementation. While the eligibility started in January, the actual combined payment for the WFP recipients is being processed in March 2026, backdated to the first week of January, which should be roughly a lump sum of €380. Previously, we mentioned the WFP, or Working Family Payment. The income threshold for the WFP increased by €60 per week across all family sizes. This expansion allows more squeezed middle, as some refer to them as, families to qualify for the supplement. What is the new weekly income limit for 2026? One child would be €765 as the weekly income limit. 2 children would be €866, 3, €967, and 4 would be €1,058. Looking towards politics, we won't spend too long here, but just a quick summary. There was a couple interesting things happening between the 3rd of Jan and the 8th of Jan. So the Donohoe department, some referred to it as a double vacuum, because Paschal Donohoe, as his full name would be, Paschal Donohoe wasn't just a TD. He was the Minister of Finance and the President of Eurogroup. Some would say there was a cabinet shift at this time. His departure triggered an immediate reshuffle. What happened? Well, Simon Harris took over as the Minister of Finance, while Helen McEntee moved into the role of Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense. There was some interesting movements around candidates for the week of the vetting and nodding process, which reached a fever pitch. And we'll just kind of dive into that a little bit now. in relation to what the parties were doing with candidates and so on and so forth related to elections. So Fine Gael's dilemma at that time was that the party spent early January debating on whether to run a high-profile national figure or maybe a more local figure. By the end of the week, Councillor Ray McAdam, or then known as the Lord Mayor of Dublin, began to dominate internal discussions as the continuity candidate, which the goal there was to maintain Donohoe's ground level machine. From a Sinn Féin perspective, Mary Lou and Sinn Féin saw this as an opportunity to secure a second seat for the party. There was a significant internal debate between backing Janice Boland, a longtime local favorite, or Gillian Sherritt, who gained national prominence through her healthcare advocacy. Also, the monk factor entered into the equation, and we'll dive into that now. So, a major disruption occurred when the candidate Jerry the Monk Hutch signaled his serious intent to run as an independent, and this forced every major political party to recalibrate their security and populist messaging during the first week of the year. Okay, so some other political shifts not totally local to Dublin. While Dublin was the central focus of the week, there was also the Galway West by-election prep, which was also underway at that time. This was to fill the vacant seat, which was Catherine Connolly's following her election as the President of Ireland. This created a dual front battle for the government across both sides of the country. Let's look at some public safety events that happened as well across the country. Some interesting ones that happened, which you can see on the screen here, related to drug raids and arson attacks. So the events of early January 2026 highlighted a period of significant activity for An Garda Síochána, focusing on high-value organized crime, disruptions, and a disturbing case of localized property destruction. So what happened? Well, Operation Tara, this was a major drug seizure that was just over 300,000 euros. A range of drugs were seized, we'll get into that in a minute, but on the evening of Friday, January 2nd, Garda from the Limerick Divisional Drug Unit conducted a series of coordinated searches as part of Operation Tara, the national anti-drug strategy. These mainly took place in the likes of Limerick and Cork, and there were seizures of drugs related to cannabis, Xanax, cocaine, and amphetamines. A range of values in between them. The highest value seized was cannabis, just shy of 200,000 euros. The lowest value being amphetamines, which was valued at over 4,000 euros. There were some arrests made, a man in his 40s and a woman in her 30s. And we will also talk about the arson attack which happened in Meath. And as we go through this, we'll talk about the information which we knew at the time, so more information to come related to these stories. So the arson attack that destroyed 8 cars in Meath, this was a severe incident which occurred late on the night of January 2nd, 2026 in County Meath. So the incident at approximately 10:50 p.m. had emergency services called to the rear of Nanny's Pub on Main Street. 8 cars were found engulfed in flames. The emergency response? Well, we saw fire crews from the likes of Drogheda and Navan respond to the scene. The fire was so close to the building that staff, customers, and residents in overhead accommodation had to urgently be evacuated, and there were fortunately no injuries reported. Garda from Ashburn treated the scene as a crime scene to preserve it for technical examination by the Garda Technical Bureau. Local representatives described the attack as planned and focused, and Senator Sharon Keegan noted that CCTV footage reported showed that 3 individuals were involved, one of whom may have sustained burn injuries. And the community was urged to report anyone presenting themselves to hospitals or pharmacies with unexplained burns to their lower body. Taking another look, we also had a festival happening in Ireland. For example, Ireland's Mental Health Arts and Cultural Festival. This was between the 6th and the 10th of January. You're going to see that there was a range of things happening. For example, music at Vickery Street. There were sensory-friendly museum tours. and art installations as well. So on the opening night, the festival traditionally opened on Little Christmas, celebrating women's voices. There was a venue referred to as Whelan's in Dublin, which had a curated evening of music and poetry. There was also other music and spoken word events happening for the likes, for example, in Vickers Street, which hosted a couple major arts events related to therapy sessions in relation to music and spoken word. For example, we also had other things happening too, like the therapeutic and immersion art installation, which was a virtual reality sensory experience to foster empathy and self reflection. One of those VR events was called Mammy Mountain, which was an immersive VR exploration of the breast cancer journey, weaving through patient voices and survivor stories to provide a visceral, empathetic look at healthcare trauma. Of course, we also had a range of museums offering, for example, quiet hours, for example, at 10 a.m. The museum reduced sensory input, for example, the likes of lighting and sound, and provided sensory packs containing ear defenders and stimulation toys, often referred to as stim toys. Museum educators also hosted handling tablets where visitors could interact with historic objects through touch. So, just some key accessibility features in 2026 were the likes to make the festival truly inclusive. Several new measures were also implemented. For example, there were some social narratives outlined. For example, online guides were provided for venues like Smock Alley and Molly, shown photos of the entrances, lighting, and sound levels so visitors knew exactly what to expect before arriving. And there was also masked performances. Specific events included HEPA air filtration and mandatory FFP2 masks, allowing those for the likes from the immunocompromised community to attend safely. And as far as the first week in mention, that's a wrap, really. So thanks for go ahead and following along with me. If you would like to like and subscribe, that'd be great. And just to round up the topics which we covered today at a high level, we went over some science exhibitions that were featured at the BT Young Scientists exhibition. We talked about some budget rollouts from 2026, which were hot news at the time. We also looked at some post resignation politics. We touched on drug raids and arson events and the first Fortnite festival of the year. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.